My mom walked out when I was 3 and pretended I never existed. 20 years later, she came back, and lied even harder. I was 3 when my mom told my grandma she was going away for the weekend with a friend and left me with her like it was nothing, like that was normal, like that was something real mothers did. And then she never came back, or well, she came back a year later but only through some voice on the phone telling my grandma not to ruin her new life and to stop calling. And that was the last time she ever reached out herself. I didn't understand it then, not really, just that she was gone and my grandma never let me feel like I was missing anything, even when I was. She didn't talk much about my mom, and when I asked, she'd just say, she made her choices, and that was it. Nothing more, not angry, not cold, just final. I grew up in a quiet 2-bedroom apartment with a woman who worked 2 jobs and cooked from scratch and kept a drawer of old photos locked away in her closet. I found them once. A younger version of my mother in nightclub dresses, arms around guys, champagne in hand, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I just stared and closed the drawer and didn't bring it up again. Not until years later. School was normal, life was simple. We never had much, but we never lacked anything that mattered. I never knew my father. I never really felt the absence until teachers made us do those family tree projects, and I had to explain why my mom was listed but not in my life. Why my grandma came to every parent-teacher meeting and why there was never anyone else. I didn't lie, but I didn't explain either, and somehow that became a habit. Even now, I just say, I was raised by my grandmother, and leave it at that. People usually nod and drop it, which I like, because how do you even begin to explain being discarded before you were old enough to spell your own name? Not because she was dying or poor or couldn't handle it, but because she just didn't want to deal with a kid. I used to tell myself she probably had a good reason, that maybe it was hard for her too. But the older I got, the less that story held up, because hard doesn't mean disappear, hard doesn't mean forget. And she forgot me so completely that when I turned 18 and no letter came, no call, no message, nothing, not even a bad attempt, I realized I wasn't on her mind at all. I'd stopped hoping by then. But that moment still hit me harder than I expected. Like, even if you stop waiting at the door, some part of you still listens for the knock, and when it never comes, it stings. But I had a good life anyway, thanks to the woman who stayed, who never made me feel like a mistake, even though she was still hurt by her daughter's choice. I think she tried to protect me from that pain by not speaking of it, by not letting it live in the house, but it was always there in the silence, in the drawer, in the way she held her coffee a little tighter whenever the topic came close. I owe her everything. And I never felt incomplete until the day that woman, the one who left, knocked on our door like it hadn't been 21 years since she walked away. I got off work late that night, checked my phone twice like always, unlocked the door, and found my grandma at the kitchen table just sitting there like she'd been waiting for hours, tea cold in her hands, that quiet tension in the room like someone had either died or come back from the dead. And when I asked what was wrong, she didn't look up, just said flat like she was commenting on the weather, "Your mother came by today." And I swear it didn't register for a full 3 seconds, like my brain had to reboot before I could even react. And then the words caught up with the meaning and I sat down fast because my legs didn't feel solid anymore. She said she came around noon, no warning, no message, just walked up and rang the bell like this was a regular visit and not the first time she'd bothered to show her face in 21 years. And Grandma said she opened the door and for a second thought she was hallucinating. But no, there she was, the daughter she hadn't seen since I was in diapers, hair perfect, nails done, clothes that screamed money, and a sad little smile like we were about to patch things up and go shopping together or some shit. I asked what she wanted and Grandma said, "You, apparently," and those 2 words made something twist in my stomach, like bile or panic. I couldn't tell which. She didn't say much else, just that she was ready to reconnect, that she wanted to see me, that she'd changed. And Grandma told her the truth, that I was doing fine, that I didn't need her, that if she was coming back to fix something, she was 20 years too late. I asked if she got angry. Grandma said no. She just kept that same calm, wide-eyed face and acted like the victim, like showing up was some big act of bravery and not the bare minimum she avoided for 2 decades. Then she tried to walk past Grandma like she had some kind of right to come in the house, and that's when Grandma lost it a little, told her to get off the porch and don't come back, that this wasn't her home, that she left that title behind with the last check she bothered to send. I sat there listening to all this and couldn't find a single thing to say, because what do you even say when someone who abandoned you tries to show up again like it's nothing? And then Grandma looked me dead in the eyes and said, "She'll try to reach out to you, and I won't stop her. That's your call now." And I nodded even though my whole body was screaming no. Because yeah, maybe I did want to see her, maybe I wanted to ask why, Maybe I needed to hear it straight from her mouth instead of secondhand stories and silence. But there was another part of me. The part raised on scraped knees and soup in chipped bowls and quiet love that never needed big words, that already hated her for making me choose at all. I sat in my room the rest of the night staring at my phone, waiting for it to light up, wondering what kind of person it takes to walk out on their own kid and then decide. 20 years later they're ready to be a parent, like that's how time works, like I'm just a book she left unfinished and now suddenly wants to pick back up from the middle. We met at a cafe near my job, neutral ground, nothing fancy. I picked the place on purpose because I didn't want anything soft or sentimental. I didn't want background music or mood lighting or anything that might make me forget how angry I was supposed to be. But when I walked in and saw her sitting there, back straight, hands folded, eyes already watery like she'd been rehearsing the whole scene, I hesitated. Because she looked so small, so clean, like someone who'd never made a single wrong decision in her life, like the type of woman who gives TED Talks about resilience. And for a second I wondered if I was even mad anymore. But then she smiled and said my name like it was hers to say, and I felt it all rise up again. The heat, the confusion, the pressure I'd buried for years. And I sat down slowly, made sure I kept my bag in my lap like armor. And the first thing she said was, "You're even more beautiful than I imagined." And I didn't respond. I just asked why now, why after all this time, why after the birthdays and the Christmases and the first days of school and the hospital trips and the panic attacks and the graduation she never saw, why now? And she blinked fast like she was surprised I came out swinging, and then she started in on her story. That she was young, that she didn't know how to be a mother, that she met a man who promised her the world but didn't want a child, and she made a choice. And she hated herself for it every day, and yes, she sent money when she could, and no, it wasn't enough, but she thought I was better off without her. She thought Grandma could give me more stability. She thought she was doing the right thing by staying gone. And then her voice cracked and she said, "But I never stopped thinking about you." And for a second I felt something shift in my chest, something that wanted to reach across the table and say it's okay. But I didn't. I stayed where I was, arms crossed, chin up. And I asked, "Why didn't you call?" And she said she was scared I'd hate her, and I said, "I do." And she flinched like I'd slapped her. But I didn't take it back. And she nodded slowly, tears starting to fall now, the real ones or the practiced ones, I couldn't tell. And then she said she left her husband recently, that he'd been cheating for years, and she finally got the courage to walk away. And now she was alone. And it made her realize she didn't want to be alone anymore. She wanted a relationship with me. She wanted to get to know me, to rebuild, to start fresh. And the way she said it, soft, trembling, almost reverent. I almost forgot how many years she spent pretending I didn't exist. But I told her I didn't know what to do with this. I told her she was a stranger to me. I told her that people don't just get to walk back in and expect hugs and holidays. And she said she wasn't expecting anything. Just a chance, just a crack in the door. And I said I'd think about it, not because I meant it, but because I needed to get out of there before I started to feel sorry for her. And I stood up, and she reached for my hand, but I stepped back, and I saw it, just for a second, behind the watery eyes and soft voice, something sharp, something that didn't like being told no. And I left without looking back, sat in my car for 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel, trying to figure out if I felt better or worse, because I didn't know if I'd just closed a wound or opened a new one. A week after the cafe, she texted asking if I wanted to come by her place, said she was living in a small apartment temporarily, just until she got back on her feet, didn't push too hard, just, when you're ready, no pressure. And I waited a couple days before answering, mostly because I didn't want to look too eager, but also because something in her whole performance still itched under my skin, still felt off. So I agreed, said I had a couple hours after class and could swing by, and when I got there the first thing that hit me wasn't the neighborhood or the building. Both were fine, not great. It was the apartment itself, because it looked lived in and untouched at the same time, beige walls, thrift store furniture, dusty blinds, but on the coffee table was a brand new iPhone still in the plastic, next to a leather bag I knew cost more than my rent. And she opened the door smiling like we were already close, like this was normal. And the first 10 minutes were small talk, awkward silences, tea I didn't want, compliments I didn't ask for. And then she started talking about her ex, how toxic he was, how rich and controlling, how he made her feel like a piece of property, how he never really saw her, how she finally got brave enough to leave. And she framed it like this triumphant escape story, like she was a survivor crawling out from under his empire. And I wanted to believe her, because God, that would have made everything easier. But something didn't click, like how she said she was broke but her fridge had fancy imported cheeses and boxed wine that wasn't cheap, or how she claimed to be starting over but never mentioned looking for a job, just vague things like talking to lawyers and sorting out assets, and she kept asking me things like what I was studying, who I was dating, whether I thought I'd stay in the city or move somewhere with more opportunity, and I felt like I was being profiled, not caught up with, like she was collecting data for some plan I wasn't in on. But I smiled and nodded and stayed polite because part of me still wanted this to work, still wanted her to be someone I could explain, someone I could show off in small pieces to the people in my life without having to add asterisks or backstories. And when I said I should get going, she asked if I needed anything, groceries, cash, rides, whatever, and I said no. And she looked almost disappointed, which was weird, like saying no meant I failed some unspoken test. And when I left, I told myself maybe I'd misread it. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I went back a few days later anyway, just to see if the weird feeling would go away, and it didn't, because this time the phone was gone, the purse was gone, the cheeses were replaced with instant noodles, and she looked tired and annoyed, like she didn't expect me to show up unannounced, like the scene hadn't been set properly. And I started noticing more little things, the way she always talked about what people owed her, what had been taken from her, the way she never asked about my childhood or grandma or how I felt about her vanishing. Just about what I thought of her ex and what he'd told his lawyers, and I started bringing food when I visited because I could tell she wasn't eating right, and she'd take it but never said thank you, just complained about how heavy life was, how unfair, how no one helped her, and it started dawning on me that I wasn't the reunion she wanted, I was the resource, I was the sympathy, I was the witness she needed to sell a version of herself to someone else, and every time I left that apartment, I felt like I was stepping out of a story I didn't write, one where my role was already assigned. And it made my skin crawl. It started with a knock, calm but confident, not the kind that says delivery or neighbor, the kind that means someone came here on purpose, and I opened the door and there was a man, maybe in his 50s, dark coat, polite face, not smiling, just assessing, and behind him at the curb was this black SUV that looked like it belonged to a politician or a cartel, glossy and massive, one of those vehicles you know cost more than some people's houses, and he nodded and said, "Delivery for Eliza Marsh." And I froze for a second because nobody ever used that name here, not in this house, not since I was 3, and I asked, "Who's it from?" And he said, "It's personal," and held out a thick envelope with no return address, but everything about the way he stood said legal, and I just stared and said, "She doesn't live here," and he said, "She listed this as her alternate contact address," and then he looked me over again like he was trying to place me and couldn't, and I told him she doesn't live here, that she used to, but it's been over 20 years, and he nodded and said, "Not surprising," and then asked, "You know where she is now?" And I didn't answer right away, just watched that stupid SUV gleaming in the sun like it had no business on this block, and finally I said, "Yeah, I know where she is," and before I could stop myself I added, "Why, she owe you something?" And he almost smiled but didn't, just said, "Not me, my employer," and I asked, "Who's that?" And he said, "Her ex-husband," and I said nothing because suddenly I didn't trust my voice. And he went on like he was reading off a script he didn't write, said they were finalizing divorce paperwork, that things had gotten complicated, that she'd shown up at his office uninvited several times, that she'd been warned to stop, and then he paused and asked, "Are you a friend of hers?" And I looked him in the eye and said, "I'm her daughter." And he blinked like I'd slapped him, and I watched him actually take a step back and say, "She said she didn't have any family," and I nodded and said, "Yeah, I figured." And that's when the conversation changed. He started explaining more, how she'd been caught cheating, how the prenup said infidelity meant she walked away with nothing, how she was refusing to sign the paperwork, threatening to go public with stories, emotional appeals, legal drama, whatever she could leverage, how she was burning bridges like that was a form of revenge, and I just stood there, with the envelope in my hands feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's story, because nothing about this version of her surprised me. It just made everything make more sense, the apartment with the luxury phone and no job, the pity routines, the sudden interest in me after 21 years of silence, the lies that didn't even try to hold up under daylight. And he asked again, "You're really her daughter?" And I said yeah, again, but quieter, and I didn't offer any more, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable like he'd walked into a scene with the wrong script, said sorry for the mix-up, that he didn't mean to cause trouble, just following up on delivery, and he walked off, got into that tank of a car, and drove off slow like he was still trying to piece together what just happened. And I went back inside and didn't say a word, not yet, just put the envelope on the counter and sat down. Because for the first time I realized my mother wasn't just a liar, she was an eraser. She deleted people when they didn't serve her story anymore, and I wasn't even mad, I was embarrassed I didn't see it sooner. I opened the envelope. I don't even know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe spite, maybe because I needed something solid after all the smoke she'd been feeding me. Inside was a typed contract and a letter on thick paper written in a pen that looked way too expensive for the tone it carried. The letter wasn't to me, it was to her, Eliza, at the top in sharp print. And I read it, just the letter. Didn't bother with the legal pages underneath because the words in ink said enough. It was from her ex-husband. Calm and cruel in the way only rich men can be. It said he was offering her $50,000, a one-time payment in exchange for her silence and her absence, that if she signed the included paperwork and stayed away from him, his family, his employees, his property, that would be the end of it. But if she kept showing up, kept calling his sisters, crashing office meetings, scratching cars in the staff lot, yeah, that was in there. Then he'd make it his personal mission to legally destroy her, that he'd happily spend 200 grand if it meant she didn't get a single cent. And I sat with that letter in my hands for maybe 5 minutes, not angry, not even surprised anymore, just emptied, like the last part of me that wanted to believe she was misunderstood finally gave up. And I walked back to the kitchen and set it on the table, and Grandma looked up like she already knew and just waited, didn't say anything, just kept folding towels until I said, "I think I'm ready to hear the whole thing." And she nodded and finally sat down across from me like this was the part she'd been holding back for years, like she was finally allowed to tell the truth now that I'd seen it for myself. And she said, "Your mother never wanted this life, not with you, not with me, not with anyone who didn't have something shiny to offer her." And then she told me everything, how my mom hated this house, hated this neighborhood, used to sneak out through her window at 17 to hang out with older guys who had cars and clubs and cash, how she dropped out of college after one semester and disappeared for weeks, months, chasing some man twice her age who promised her a condo and a better last name, how she came back suddenly with me in her arms and no explanation except that she'd figured it out, and Grandma hoped, really hoped, that maybe I'd change her, that motherhood would stick. But it didn't, not even for 3 years, because then one day she said she was just going away for the weekend with a friend, a short trip, nothing big, left you with Grandma like it was the most natural thing. And 2 days later that friend showed up at the door alone and said Eliza had met someone new, a man, said she'd stayed behind and would be back soon. But she didn't come back that week, or the one after, and then a week later she called and said she was starting over, fresh, that this was her chance to have the life she wanted, and not to worry, that she'd send money and be in touch, and she did, for a while. Payments came every month for about 2 years, and then less, and then almost never, and every time Grandma tried to reach her, silence, until one day, years later, she finally answered the phone, and before Grandma could say anything, she snapped, "Don't ruin this for me, I'm finally starting over." And that was the last word she said to her own mother for over 2 decades. No letters, no birthdays, just wire transfers that got smaller and eventually stopped. And Grandma said she told people I was her daughter, because it was easier than explaining that her actual child didn't want to be a parent, didn't want to be responsible, didn't even want to be remembered. And when I asked why she never told me all this sooner, Grandma said she wanted me to have a chance to grow up not thinking I was a burden or a leftover. And I think that's when I finally cried, not for her, not even for me, but for the version of me that kept hoping this would make sense one day, because now it did, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. I called her myself, didn't text, didn't ask how she was, just said I had something to give her, a letter that came to the house, and she sounded too cheerful, like she thought this was me reaching out to fix things, said, "Of course, come by any time," and I picked a time, showed up with the envelope in my bag already opened, not because I wanted to snoop but because I needed to know what she was dragging into my life. And when she saw it in my hand she smiled at first until she noticed the torn seal, then her whole face shifted, eyes hard, mouth tight, and she asked, "You opened it?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "So?" And I said, "I'm shocked." And she laughed like I just told her a bad joke, said, "Oh please, don't start, you think he's some angel? All men are the same," and then pointed at the letter like it was trash, like it didn't matter that he offered her money just to disappear, and said, "You think that's love? You think that's justice? You don't know shit." And I stayed quiet at first, didn't want to fight, just wanted to drop the bomb and walk away. But she kept pushing, kept spinning it like I was the traitor here, like I'd chosen him over her, said, "You always were a little ingrate, just like your grandmother, always judging, always thinking you're better." And I said, "I just wanted the truth." And she said, "No, you wanted someone to hate, and now you've picked me." And then she stepped closer and said it right to my face, "You disgust me." And that broke something in me, not because it hurt, it didn't, but because it confirmed everything I tried not to believe, and I told her, Good, then we're even. But then I stopped at the door, turned back and said, actually, no, we're not even, because there's only one traitor in this story, and it's you. You betrayed me, you betrayed Grandma, and you even betrayed that man who carried your weight for years and still offered you a way out with dignity, and, her face twisted but I didn't stop. You know what those 50,000 are? That's mercy. Mercy you never earned, and I turned to leave again, but she followed, yelling, you think this is over? You think you can just cut me out? I'm not going anywhere, you hear me? That apartment, that's my home, my mother's home, you can't erase me, and I stopped, hand on the door, turned around and said, you already erased yourself, 20 years ago, and she said, legally it's still mine, and I looked her dead in the eye and said, no, it's not, the deed's in my name, has been since I turned 16, not 1 inch of that place is yours, and I watched her freeze like she'd just been slapped with a truth she hadn't prepared for, and she tried to cover it, tried to laugh again, but it sounded forced and cracked, and I said nothing else, just walked out, didn't slam the door, didn't look back, just left her standing in the middle of that pathetic rental with her stories and her rage and her name that meant nothing to me anymore, and when I got outside, I finally exhaled, like I'd been holding my breath since I was 3. It's been a year since I last saw her face, a full year since that fight in her apartment when she told me I disgusted her and I told her she'd earned it, and I thought that would be the end, really thought she'd disappear like she always did, but people like her don't vanish when you want them to, they vanish when it's convenient for them, and apparently, burning bridges still wasn't enough, because a few months later, her ex-husband contacted me directly, through his assistant, said he needed to speak with me about a legal matter, and I was hesitant. I'd had enough courtroom drama in my life without stepping into someone else's, but he wasn't asking for much, just a statement, a testimony, confirmation that she'd never raised me, never supported me, that she'd abandoned me and lied about it, and I said yes, because it was the truth, and I was tired of her rewriting it. And when I arrived at the hearing I expected lawyers and silence, but instead he pulled me aside himself and said, I'm sorry, not cold, not stiff, real, the kind of sorry that comes with weight. And he apologized not just for dragging me into court, but for not checking her story when they met, for believing her when she said she had no family, for letting my name be erased for 2 decades without even knowing it, and I didn't know what to say, because none of it was his fault, but he apologized anyway, like he carried the guilt just for being around her, and when the judge read the decision, clean break, no settlement, restraining order, he thanked me again and said, let me do something for you, and I told him no, told him I didn't want anything. But a month later a letter came to the house saying my tuition was paid in full, all 4 years, no strings, and another one after that, a formal offer for an internship with a firm tied to his business, aligned with my degree. And when I called to say thank you but I couldn't accept that much, he said, it's not a gift, it's a correction, and I didn't argue after that, I just said thank you and meant it, and now it's been almost 3 months since I started that job, my first real job, my name on a desk, my ID badge in the elevator, real work, real hours, real money, and every time I come home to Grandma's place, my place, and see her slippers by the couch and her tea still warm on the table, I feel safe in a way I didn't think I ever would. And I'm building something now, slow and small but solid, no drama, no lies, just life, and yeah, I still think about her sometimes, when I walk past certain stores, or hear certain songs, or when someone's voice hits a pitch she used to use when she was playing nice. And she still texts sometimes, new numbers every few months, fake apologies, guilt trips, silence bombs followed by, I miss you, and, you'll regret this. But I don't answer, I don't even read them all the way anymore. I just see her name and hit delete, and it doesn't hurt, not really, because I finally understand, she didn't lose me, she never really had me, and I didn't escape her, I outgrew her, and I'm done trying to figure out if that makes me heartless or healed. Because honestly, I don't care, I'm here, I'm still standing, I'm working, I'm helping Grandma with her meds and her garden, I'm seeing someone now, nothing serious yet but steady, kind, quiet. And when I lie awake at night it's not because I'm waiting for a mother who never came back, it's just life, and it's mine, now, not hers. Subscribe, hit the like button, and explore more fascinating stories.